I had been freelancing long enough to believe I knew how things worked. I wasn't desperate. I wasn't new. And I wasn't chasing every offer that landed in my inbox. At that point in my life, freelance was my main source of income. I had regular clients, a portfolio I was proud of, and a routine that worked. Some months were better than others, but overall, I was stable. That's important to understand, because this story isn't about a guy who jumped at the first opportunity out of fear. This was about trust. The message came through email, professional tone, clean signature, company name I vaguely recognized. The man introduced himself as a project manager for a growing business that was expanding rapidly and looking for long-term freelancers. That phrase alone should have made me cautious, but I've heard it 100 times before, and sometimes it's true. We scheduled a call. He sounded confident, calm, well-spoken. He knew exactly what he wanted and explained the project clearly. Timeline, scope, expectations. He complimented my work, mentioned specific things from my portfolio, and talked about future opportunities if this collaboration went well. That's how they get you, not with pressure, but with comfort. The project was solid. Several weeks of work, good pay, not absurdly high, not suspicious, just fair, reasonable, the kind of offer that feels safe. I asked about the contract. He didn't dodge the question, which made me trust him more. He said they usually handled paperwork after the first phase, once both sides were comfortable. "We prefer to establish trust first," he said. "Then we formalize everything." That sentence stayed with me. I remember thinking, that's not ideal, but it's not crazy either. And that's where I made my first mistake. I told myself this wasn't a random client. They had a website, a company name, LinkedIn profiles. Everything looked legitimate on the surface. I convinced myself that insisting on paperwork would make me look difficult, like I didn't trust them. So I agreed. The first week went smoothly. I delivered exactly what was expected. On time, clean, professional. He responded quickly, praised the work, asked for small adjustments, nothing unreasonable. In fact, he seemed pleased, almost impressed. That validation felt good. Not because I needed it, but because it reinforced the idea that this was a real collaboration, not a one-sided transaction. Then came the first, small request. "Could you just take a quick look at this as well? Nothing major. Shouldn't take long." I did it. Then another request. Then another. Each one came with the same tone. Friendly, appreciative, professional. Always framed as a favor, never a demand. By the end of the second week, I had delivered more than we originally agreed on. Still no contract. Still no payment. I told myself it was fine. Payment was scheduled after the first phase. That was the plan. I wasn't worried yet. People delay things. That happens. But something had started to shift. Not externally, internally. I noticed how quickly I responded to his messages, how carefully I worded mine, how I avoided bringing up money too directly, even though I had every right to. I didn't realize it then, but the dynamic had already changed. I was working. They were evaluating. And when that balance tilts, it rarely tilts back in your favor. At the time, I still believed everything would work out. I still believed professionalism meant protection. I hadn't learned yet that some people don't steal by force. They steal by making you comfortable enough to keep going. By the time the third week started, the project no longer felt like a trial phase. It felt like work. Real work. Structured, demanding, and increasingly time-consuming. I had reorganized my schedule around it, pushing smaller clients aside, because I believed this one was going to turn into something long-term. That belief made everything easier to justify. The requests kept coming, always polite, always reasonable on the surface, Small additions, minor changes, quick fixes that shouldn't take long. Each one was framed as part of the same project, part of the same growing relationship. I kept track of my hours. I kept notes. I told myself that if anything went wrong, I'd have records. But records don't create leverage. Agreements do. At some point, I asked again about the contract, casually, carefully, like I didn't want to seem impatient. He responded almost immediately. "Absolutely," he wrote. "Let's finalize everything once we wrap up this phase. Accounting prefers to process payments in batches." That sounded official enough, corporate enough, believable. So I kept working. What changed next wasn't the workload, it was the tone. Messages started arriving later. Feedback became shorter. Not rude, just efficient. Less enthusiasm, less praise, more expectation. I noticed that when I delivered something early, there was no acknowledgement. When I asked a question, the reply came hours later instead of minutes. Subtle shifts, but they mattered. Still, nothing crossed a clear line. The first payment date passed quietly. No message, no explanation. I waited a day, then 2. Then I followed up. He apologized and blamed an internal delay. "Nothing serious," he said. "Just a temporary issue on our side." I believed him. I wanted to believe him. At that point, I was already deep into the project. Walking away would have meant accepting that weeks of work might go unpaid, and that thought was harder to face than another promise. So I stayed. Another week passed. I delivered the last major part of the project. Everything they had asked for. Everything we had discussed. I expected that to be the moment things settled, that we'd talk about payment clearly, that the formalization phase would finally begin. Instead, I got a new request. "Before we move forward," he wrote, "could you just prepare a small revision? The client wants to see one more option." That sentence told me more than he probably realized. There was a client, which meant there was money somewhere. I did the revision. When I sent it, I didn't just wait. I asked directly, "When can I expect payment for the completed phase?" This time, the response took longer. When it came, it was longer too. Full of words, apologies, explanations, none of them concrete. "Things are a bit complicated right now," he wrote, "but rest assured, your work is valued. We're just aligning internal processes." That was the moment I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic, not anger. Recognition. I realized I had crossed the point where politeness protected me. I had become too accommodating, too patient, too invested. I had allowed the relationship to move forward without securing the one thing that mattered. Payment. I considered stopping. I really did. But stopping now would mean admitting I had been wrong from the beginning. And that's a hard thing for any professional to do. So I waited. And waiting, I learned, is exactly what people like this count on. They don't disappear immediately. They stretch time. They dilute urgency. And while you're trying to be reasonable, they're buying themselves space. By the end of that week, I sent another message. Shorter this time. Clearer. "I can't continue without resolving payment." This time, the reply didn't come at all. The silence lasted longer than I expected. At first, I told myself it was temporary. A busy day, a missed message, time zone differences. I refreshed my inbox more often than I'd like to admit, even though I knew better. Professionals don't ghost each other after weeks of collaboration. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. By the third day, that belief started to crack. I sent a short follow-up, polite, direct. No accusations, just clarity. No response. I tried calling the number he had used before, straight to voicemail. I left a calm message, asking him to call me back. Nothing emotional, nothing threatening, just professional. That voicemail was never returned. By the end of the week, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Messages unread, emails unanswered. The chat platform we had used suddenly showed him as offline permanently. That's when the reality set in. Not like a punch, like a slow drop. I checked the company website again. It was still there, but stripped down. Half the pages no longer worked. Contact forms led nowhere. The LinkedIn profiles I had looked at before were either private or gone entirely. I started digging deeper. The company registration still existed, but the address led to a shared office space. No real presence, no real accountability. Just enough structure to look legitimate to someone who wanted to believe it. I replayed every interaction in my head, every moment where I accepted an excuse, every time I delayed pushing back, every message where I softened my tone instead of setting a boundary. The worst part wasn't the money, though losing weeks of income hurts. It was the realization that the entire situation had been designed around my professionalism, around my patience, around my desire to be seen as easy to work with. They didn't rush me. They didn't threaten me. They didn't disappear immediately. They let me work. They let me deliver. And once they had everything they needed, they slowly stepped away. I sent one final email. Not polite, not aggressive, just honest. I told him I expected payment. I told him I had records of the work delivered. I told him I was prepared to escalate the situation if necessary. That email bounced. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. That's when it hit me. Not emotionally, but practically. There was nothing left to escalate. No contract. No signed agreement. No legal leverage. Just work delivered in good faith to someone who never intended to honor it. I felt something close to anger then, but it didn't last. Anger requires an opponent. What I felt instead was emptiness, a kind of quiet humiliation that comes from realizing you played your part perfectly in someone else's plan. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not friends, not other freelancers. I didn't want sympathy. And I definitely didn't want advice I already knew. I needed time to sit with it, to accept that I had lost the money, and more importantly, to accept why. Because this wasn't bad luck. It was a system that relies on people like me believing that professionalism will be returned with fairness, that trust will be matched with responsibility. That experience protects you from exploitation. It doesn't. Experience only helps after the lesson is paid for, and I had just paid for mine. By the time I stopped checking my inbox, I already knew there would be no message waiting for me. No apology, no explanation, no resolution. The silence wasn't temporary, it was the end. When it finally became clear that no response was coming, I stopped feeling angry. Anger needs hope to survive. Hope that something can still be fixed, explained, or reversed. And once that hope was gone, what remained was something colder, but more useful. Acceptance. Not the kind that excuses what happened, but the kind that forces you to look at your own role in it without lying to yourself. I stopped checking my inbox. I stopped replaying old conversations. I stopped imagining what I should have said differently. The money was gone. The time was gone. And no amount of emotional energy was going to bring either of them back. What mattered now was understanding why it happened. Not to punish myself, but to make sure it never happened again. I went through everything step by step, every decision I made, every moment where I felt slight discomfort and chose to ignore it, every excuse that sounded reasonable enough to delay action. The truth was uncomfortable, but clear. I wasn't tricked by force. I wasn't manipulated by lies. I was slowly guided by politeness. I wanted to be professional, easy to work with, flexible. I didn't want to slow the process down with contracts, conditions, or hard questions. I told myself that trust was part of good collaboration, that experienced people don't need rigid structure. That belief cost me weeks of work. Freelancing doesn't punish you for being bad at your job. It punishes you for being bad at protecting your time. What hurt the most wasn't just losing the money. It was realizing how predictable the whole process had been, how carefully it was designed to take advantage of someone who values cooperation over confrontation. They didn't rush me. They didn't pressure me. They never raised their voice or crossed an obvious line. They simply kept asking for a little more while delaying the one thing that mattered. And I kept delivering because stopping felt harder than continuing. That's the trap. By the time you realize what's happening, you've already invested too much to walk away comfortably. And they know that. After this experience, I changed the way I worked completely. Not aggressively, not defensively, structurally. I stopped starting projects without written terms, even for small test phases. I stopped accepting vague timelines for payment. I stopped working past agreed scopes without renegotiation. And most importantly, I stopped apologizing for asking basic questions. Surprisingly, the right clients didn't mind at all. The people who respected my work respected clarity. They welcomed contracts. They paid on time. They didn't disappear when expectations were written down. The ones who pushed back, they disappeared early, which was exactly the point. That's when I understood something important. If someone reacts negatively to boundaries, they were never planning to respect them. I eventually recovered financially. Freelance work has a way of continuing if you stay consistent. New projects came. Better projects. But the version of me who took them on was different, more precise, more grounded, less eager to please. That experience didn't make me cynical. It made me deliberate. And that difference matters. Because in freelance, no one protects you by default. Not platforms, not clients, not professionalism itself. You are the only one responsible for drawing the line and holding it. So if you're watching this and you work independently, ask yourself this. Have you ever kept working even though something felt off, just because you didn't want to be difficult? And if you have, did it cost you money, time, or both? Sometimes the most expensive lessons aren't paid with cash, they're paid with silence. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It really helps the channel grow.